It's Wednesday, October 9th. I'm Jane Coaston, and this is What a Day, the show where we are sending out our 90s kid bat signal because Limited 2 announced that it's making clothing for adults. Yes, the iconic brand that is traditionally aimed at preteens has launched an adult line, because as I can attest, the desire to dress like you did when you were in 6th grade is extremely strong. I'm not thinking about frosted lip gloss right now, but I'm not thinking about frosted lip gloss. On today's show, how Republicans are using anti-trans messaging on the campaign trail. Plus, adult film stars launch a swing state campaign to stop Trump and Project 2025. But first,
this is literally catastrophic. And I can say without any dramatization whatsoever, if you choose to stay in one of those evacuation areas, you're going to die.
Wow. That's Tampa Mayor Jane Castor speaking with CNN Tuesday about just how dangerous Hurricane Milton could be. The storm is expected to make landfall along Florida's Gulf Coast as soon as tonight or early Thursday. It will be the Southeast's second powerful storm in less than 2 weeks. As of Tuesday evening, Milton was on course to hit the city of Tampa. It had also re-strengthened to a Category 5 storm. More than 5.5 million people in the Tampa Bay area have already been told to evacuate. Some are headed inland to Orlando. That's where Amanda Billings lives with her family. They got a room in a hotel ahead of the storm. She talked to us on Tuesday.
Being in a tourist area, it's hard because we're just trying to get our lives together and make sure that we're good because we live here, while tourists are still trying to come down and have a vacation, and they're eating up resources we need. I currently have my gas light on in my car and can't seem to find gas anywhere, which is unnerving. I don't plan to evacuate, but I do need to have gas to get back and forth. We've still been expected to come to work and live our normal lives while also trying to pack everything up and just make it work. So it's been stressful.
Word to the wise. If you were thinking about going on vacation in Orlando this week, don't. Milton is coming right on the heels of Helene. And if you're thinking that 2 major catastrophic hurricanes seems like a lot for early October, you're right. Here's Matt Berg, author of our sister publication, the What a Day newsletter.
And yes, there is a link here to climate change. Scientists say warmer weather doesn't necessarily make hurricanes more frequent, but warmer water does make them more intense. Think higher wind speeds, more rain, and stronger storm surges.
The Supreme Court seemed to signal support for a Biden administration effort to curtail one particular type of gun. On Tuesday, the court heard arguments in a case over whether the federal government can regulate ghost guns. These are guns that are typically assembled from kits that can be bought online or 3D printed at home. And they're called ghosts because they don't have serial numbers, making them hard to trace back to their owners or run a background check. The case is centered around a rule enacted by the Biden administration in 2022 that expanded the legal definition of firearms to include unassembled gun part kits. And the court seemed open to upholding it. At one point, Pete Patterson, the attorney for gun rights groups who had sued to block the rule change, tried to compare assembling a ghost gun to car maintenance. But Chief Justice John Roberts didn't seem to buy it.
Some individuals, just like some individuals enjoy working on their car every weekend, some individuals want to construct their own firearms. So the purpose of selling it is to allow, is to assist and provide individuals with material with which they can do that.
Well, I mean, drilling a hole or two, I would think doesn't give the same sort of reward that you get from working on your car on the weekends.
It's unclear when the High Court will issue its ruling. Vice President Kamala Harris is on a media blitz this week trying to reach as many voters as possible. During her 60 Minutes interview with correspondent Bill Whitaker that aired Monday, Harris managed to navigate around tough questions about a wide range of topics like the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine, the economy, and immigration. Here she responds to Whitaker pushing her on border security.
Fast forward to a moment when a bipartisan group of members of the United States Senate, including one of the most conservative members of the United States Senate, got together, came up with a border security bill. Well, guess what happened? Donald Trump got word that this bill was afoot and could be passed, and he wants to run on a problem instead of fixing a problem, so he told his buddies in Congress, kill the bill, don't let it move forward.
Harris's interview was supposed to air alongside a similar interview with former President Donald Trump, but Trump backed out. Here's the network's Scott Pelley.
The campaign offered shifting explanations. First, it complained that we would fact-check the interview. We fact-check every story.
Oof. On Tuesday, Harris joined The View and spoke about the devastation from Hurricane Helene she saw while traveling in North Carolina and Georgia last week. She also managed to get in a few digs on Trump and the lies he's been spreading about the federal response.
People are losing their home with no hope of ever being able to reconstruct or return. Yeah. And the idea that somebody would be playing political games for the sake of himself, but this is so consistent about Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. He puts himself before the needs of others. I fear that he really lacks empathy on a very basic level.
Next, she sat down with radio host Howard Stern. During the interview, he told Harris that she won his vote.
It's really weird, too, because to me, you're the law and order candidate. And yet they try to paint you like you're some leftist who I don't know, who wants to have people running through the streets committing crimes. You were a prosecutor.
I have put a lot of people in jail.
She finished up Tuesday with an appearance on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. She'll also sit for a town hall with Univision Thursday. Taken together, it shows how the Harris campaign is trying to reach as broad an audience as possible, which is, smart for an election that's national. Meanwhile, Trump continues to pander to his base and call into safe spaces to whine about Harris, like he did Tuesday with the Ben Shapiro Show on Twitter, or X, as Elon Musk would like you to call it.
And the woman doesn't know what she's doing. I watched her. I got to watch last night, 60 Minutes, and she answers questions like a child.
Says the man who is afraid of a fact check and a television network whose most popular shows are about cops. Trump has bragged about his great relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin for years, like how he did in September in front of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. The guy actively fighting to get Russia out of his country.
We have a very good relationship, and I also have a very good relationship, as you know, with President Putin. And I think if we win, I think we're going to get it resolved very quickly. I really think we're going to get it resolved.
I hope we have more good relations.
We're going to have. Oh, I see. Yeah, but it takes two to tango. And.
So it should come as no surprise that in a new book, veteran journalist Bob Woodward reports that Trump has spoken with Putin, quote, maybe as many as 7 times since leaving the White House. Woodward also writes that in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, Trump, quote, secretly sent Putin a bunch of Abbott point-of-care COVID test machines for personal use. In response, Trump campaign spokesman Steve Chung said, quote, none of these made-up stories by Bob Woodward are true and are the work of a truly demented and deranged man who suffers from a debilitating case of Trump derangement syndrome. Chung also said Trump did not give Woodward any access for this book. All of these quotes sound like they were said by Trump, but that's just me. And that's the news. Now to Texas, where Democratic Congressman Colin Allred is making Republican Ted Cruz work hard to keep his Senate seat. Polls show the race is within 3 percentage points. And because this is Ted Cruz we're talking about, his campaign has decided that one path to winning re-election could be anti-trans messaging. Here's a transphobic ad from a pro-Cruz super PAC released late last month.
Colin Allred could have stopped men from competing in women's sports, but instead, he voted against our daughters. What kind of man does that?
The GOP bill Allred voted against, which this ad is completely misrepresenting, would have banned trans girls and women from playing on sports teams aligned with their gender identities at federally funded schools and colleges. And showing a male actor in an all-red jersey tackling a girl in this video is a gross way of depicting the issue. As always, trans girls are depicted in this kind of media as evil adult men. But Cruz is far from alone in using anti-trans fearmongering to court voters this election cycle. Here's a bit of an ad from the Trump campaign that's currently airing nationwide.
Kamala's agenda is they, them, not you.
I'm Donald J. Trump, and I approve this message.
Fuck you. Semafor politics reporter Dave Weigel joined us from the campaign trail in Texas. Dave, welcome to What a Day.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So you've been on the trail with Republican Texas Senator Ted Cruz this week. How has he been using anti-trans messaging at his campaign events?
How has he not been using them is a better question, because I was surprised. I was working on something about this topic, and then I saw Cruz, and I said, well, I'm not wrong. This is taking a bigger place in his messaging than I've seen it ever take before. And he's on the ballot every 6 years, but this is pretty new. He's got Colin Allred, the congressman from the Dallas area he's running against. Allred signed a letter urging the Senate to take out NDAA riders, things Republicans inserted in defense spending that would say military funding cannot go to gender reassignment medicine. Mm-hmm. It cannot go to flying the LGBT pride flag, etc. And Cruz has a whole riff in his stump speech where he says, here's what he supports. We need to ensure that all military bases can have drag shows, and the whole audience booed. We need the taxpayers to pay for sex change surgeries, boo. We need taxpayers to pay for sterilization of minors, boo. When he's trying to get boos in the crowd.
Right.
by far the biggest, the juiciest red meat he had was, can you believe that Colin Allred did this? When I talked to Allred, he said, yeah, I did it. I don't think we should be messing with the military and telling them they can't do these things.
So most polls have Cruz leading, as you mentioned, Democratic Congressman Colin Allred by about 3 points at this moment. In your view, is this fixation on trans folks going to make a difference in this race? It seems odd to be doing this now.
Right. So it's late in the game, and the evidence here for that working doesn't really exist. I've covered iterations of this for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to the groups that run these ads, and they've been kind of pointing to the rainbow that is coming. Rainbow's a wrong way to put it. Like, once people understand this issue as a social conservative message, they're going to vote with us. And Republicans, I really think, have come around to agree with this. There is polling. The Times Siena poll did some of this, where if you ask people, hey, should we respect people's gender identity, most people say yes. And Republicans say is yes. Well, with anything, if you take the most extreme example you can find and elevate it, you will find people are against that. And what they've seen in focus group and polling is that this is correct. If you say that my opponent wants sex changes for minors, that's unpopular. And if there is a Trump voter who's considering splitting this vote, tell him that again and again and again. Again, I talked to Allred, and his position was what I've heard from every Democrat. Do they go and rebut every single line of an ad? No, they say, I believe in parents making these choices. I'm not getting involved. I believe in respecting people's gender identity. That's it.
Well, I think that the thing is that when you talk to people kind of across the spectrum about these specific issues, it's like if they are made to care about it, they have some opinions on it. But this isn't like a top line issue for most people.
Yeah.
So when you talk to people in Texas, when you ask them about like what are the issues you care about, what are they saying?
Well, for Republicans, and this is most who I was talking to at Cruz events, it is the border, it is immigration. I was talking to Cruz at his gaggle after the event yesterday. He was saying, to rebut a reporter who was saying that voters care about abortion, Cruz was saying, what's the top issue? The economy. What's the number 2 issue? Immigration. What's the number 3 issue? Crime. And I said to Senator Cruz, well, you were running ads about gender and accusing your opponent of wanting girls to be outplayed by boys in sports. You didn't say that was a top issue. And so they don't deny this is not a top issue. If I have an open conversation with a Republican voter, they don't lead with this. There is an effect. If you see something on TV again and again and again, I've seen this in my career, people will start to say, oh, yeah, the thing I saw on TV, that's my top issue. And I didn't hear that yet.
So, I mean, there's a lot there. But something I keep thinking about, you mentioned this, like they tried this in 2022. Part of the red wave theory was that people were going to be so outraged about critical race theory and trans kids that they were obviously going to hand the House and Senate to Republicans. And that's not what happened. Why do you think the GOP is doubling down on this now?
Yeah. What is the evidence that this will work when it didn't in 2022? It is just that people hear about it more now. There is not something that has turned. Republicans do say they've just done more research in the last 2 years. They have more points of attack. They'll say, well, Democrats supported funding this, so they have more specific attacks. But on the basis of I'm at home and I was told that this is the inflation election or the immigration election and now I should care about this. Yeah, it really is just the theory that, well, it's in the conversation more than it used to be. So people might become aware of this and they'll vote for us.
Dave, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with Dave Weigel, politics reporter for Semafor. We'll link to Dave's story on this in our show notes. We'll be back with more in a moment, but if you like the show, make sure to subscribe, leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and share with your friends. When voters head to the polls in the next few weeks, tens of millions will face new voter ID laws that were enacted in the wake of the 2020 election, mostly in states dominated by Republicans. Republicans love voter ID laws because historically, the party has done better when fewer people vote. And while many voter ID laws are pretty explicitly targeting immigrant communities, there's another voting bloc that feels the effects. Trans people may not look or dress in a way that matches the gender marker on their ID, and election workers enforcing these rules may not know that those two things don't have to match. Not to mention, many states, like Texas, are making it harder for trans people to update their gender on things like driver's licenses and birth certificates. So how do you make sure, trans or otherwise, that you know your rights in the voting booth? Do these things affect cis people too? I spoke with Grace Panetta, political reporter for the 19th. Grace Panetta, welcome to What a Day.
Thank you so much for having me, Jane.
So, what are the kinds of laws that could have a chilling effect on trans voters this election?
Yeah, so really over the past 4 years, and especially in recent years, we have seen states, either legislatures pass statutory requirements or state agencies that are in charge of issuing driver's licenses state that trans people can no longer update their gender markers on their driver's licenses. We've seen this particularly in Republican-controlled states, the two biggest ones in terms of population being Florida and Texas, that have sort of erected these barriers to trans people getting an accurate and affirming ID. And of course, you see the overlap with a lot of these same states also require you to show an ID at the polls.
And obviously, if your ID does not match who you look like, that's going to be a giant issue for a trans voter.
Yes, there are some states, including North Carolina and Wisconsin, that have what are called reasonable resemblance requirements that require you to reasonably resemble the photo on your license.
I mean, I got a haircut once and didn't wear glasses in a different ID photo, and people were attempting to clock who I was, and I think I cannot imagine how challenging that would be for a trans voter.
These requirements are kind of very vague, and then also just it can be dangerous for a person to be at risk of being outed or being questioned as to their gender identity, especially in these states where you have anti-transgender rhetoric and legislation ramping up in the lead up to the 2024 election.
What other communities and voting blocks would this kind of law discourage from voting? Because it sounds like it's not just a challenge for trans people, it's a challenge for anyone who does not 100% resemble their ID all the time.
Right, yeah. And the thing about voter ID laws is the evidence shows, like, on balance, on the whole, they're kind of a wash. They don't meaningfully promote election security on the whole. But when it comes to specific groups, having to show ID can be kind of a mitigating factor. There's some research that was done earlier this year finding that nearly 21 million voting eligible citizens do not have a current driver's license. That's according to the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement at the University of Maryland. And it's, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, lower income people who are less likely to have valid ID to vote. So it's definitely not just transgender people who are affected by these laws.
And I think a big part of this is that, who is going to be enforcing these laws? What does that look like? Would it be up to poll workers and volunteers?
So yes, voter ID laws are up to poll workers who are volunteers who sign up to work an election to enforce, as well as these sort of reasonable resemblance requirements. And a lot of it is falling onto this volunteer workforce to enforce the law. And that's where you kind of see advocacy groups like the ACLU stepping in proactively ahead of the election to say, listen, you don't need to you say what your gender is to cast a ballot. Your gender marker doesn't need to match or correspond to your gender expression in Kansas, for example.
I want our listeners to be as informed as possible and to first and foremost not be afraid of voting. So what are the most important things our listeners need to know about their rights in the voting booth?
I think it's really important that the rise of these policies don't discourage people from casting a ballot and exercising their right to vote in this election. Even if you are in a state where there are new rules prohibiting you from updating your gender marker on your driver's license, you can still get a passport or a passport card. And all you have to do to attest to that is just attest your gender identity, and you don't need to provide underlying documentation as it stands. But really what these laws are is a chilling effect, but they should not dissuade people from casting a ballot.
Grace, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was my conversation with Grace Panetta, political reporter for the 19th. Finally, let's talk about pornography, a topic I'm sure you're thrilled to hear me discuss while you drive to work. But hear me out. The New York Times has reported that a group of adult film performers have launched an ad campaign aimed at swing states entitled, Hands Off My Porn. The campaign points to Project 2025, which does indeed state, quote, pornography should be outlawed. The people who produce and distribute it should be imprisoned. As one performer told The Times, Project 2025's ban on pornography is the most extreme proposal I have ever seen, and voters have to take that threat seriously. Yes, Project 2025 does want to outlaw pornography. And folks in the adult film industry understandably do not want pornography, a massive multi-billion-dollar business that millions of Americans enjoy, to be outlawed. But there's a very basic question that's even more interesting and concerning that I think needs to be asked. What is pornography? Really? What is it? I know that seems like a weird question to ask, but it's actually pretty critical. The courts have been trying to figure out this question for half a century, and the best they've been able to do is some combination of, quote, I know it when I see it, and, quote, appeals to the prurient interest. But what is pornography is actually the most important question we can ask, Because the scariest part of Project 2025's demand to ban porn isn't the porn ban part. It's the sentence that comes just a little earlier in the document. It reads, quote, "Pornography, manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology." Did you catch that? The people behind Project 2025 aren't just arguing that porn is bad because porn is bad. They're arguing that pornography is responsible for trans people, because the people behind Project 2025 believe that being trans is bad. See, the real issue with banning pornography is not that pornography is secretly super awesome all the time. It isn't. Or that the impact of watching porn is great for our brains. Probably not. Or that banning pornography is, both legally and logistically, impossible. It probably is. It's that no one can really define what pornography is. And the people who do want to define it sure seem like the kind of people I wouldn't want to define a 4-course brunch for me. One more thing before we go. With the election coming up and so much focus on domestic issues, foreign policy can feel overwhelming. But Pod Save the World is here to help. Each week, Ben Rhodes and Tommy Vitord break down global news, share insider stories from their time in the White House, and bring on experts to explain what really matters. From conflict to climate, they've got you covered, bringing you the latest on global affairs without the homework. New episodes drop every Wednesday in the Pod Save the World feed or on YouTube. And for extra election motivation, catch Ben's special series every Saturday until November 5th, where he's breaking down what's at stake for foreign policy between Harris and Trump. That's all for today. If you like the show, make sure you subscribe, leave a review, dust off those low-rise joggers you wore as a teen, and tell your friends to listen. And if you're into reading, and not just the fascinating history of obscenity laws like me, What A Day is also a nightly newsletter. Check it out and subscribe at crooked.com/subscribe. I'm Jane Coaston. Thanks for listening.